You're talking about our fragile past, probably the most consequential event in our past in terms of mass extinctions was the end of the Permian, the Permian mass extinction. As you know, I did a gloom and doom video on this that you're in, and my sense of it is that you're not that you're a little more sanguine about that. You're not. What are your thoughts on the possibility of anything close to that replaying if we don't get our act together?
Yeah, you can't be too sanguine when you're talking about something called the Great Dying, right?
Yeah.
And we do have to be aware of these cautionary tales. And so one of the reasons that I decided to write this book is that I really wanted to unpack what precisely the paleoclimate record, what lessons it has to offer us. And in some cases, for example, I think that the science has sometimes been portrayed in a way that would lead us to sort of greater doomism than is objectively merited. It's sort of a nuanced picture. When you look at what happened at the end of the Permian, the Great Dying, again, as we call it, the boundary between the Permian and Triassic, where 90% of all species on the planet perished. 96% of all marine species. I mean, the oceans practically died off. And we know that at the center of it was a massive input of carbon dioxide. The same greenhouse gas we're producing through fossil fuel burning today. In that case, it was due to an unusual episode of intense volcanism that pumped large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and warmed up the planet substantially. Now, some people have looked at that episode. Again, it was a massive extinction. And they've said, well, look, this was a massive extinction. It was caused by warming. They've speculated that it was due in part to a massive release of permafrost methane that had been stored in the cold regions of the planet. It had been released. Methane from the seafloor had been released into the atmosphere, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So this is sort of a vicious cycle. If you start losing methane into the atmosphere, it warms even more, and that can cause even more release of methane, potential runaway feedback. And the speculation was that's what happened back then, and that's what's happening right now in the Arctic as we warm it up. Well, there's a little bit of good news, which is that the isotopic measurements today tell us that, yes, methane is increasing in the atmosphere, but thus far we don't see a permafrost methane release signal. What we see is mostly methane from fossil fuel extraction, from natural gas, from fracking. Natural gas is mostly methane. And when it's extracted for natural gas,
so far so good.
Gas companies. So, yeah, some of it sort of escapes into the atmosphere. We call it fugitive methane. And so methane is increasing in the atmosphere, but it looks like it's coming from human activity, not a runaway feedback. And when I unpack the Great Dying, one of the things we learned is that methane doesn't appear to have played a big role there. It was mostly the carbon dioxide. And there were other sort of things that added. There was a global stink bomb, literally. If you've ever encountered a stink bomb, hydrogen sulfide, I don't know, a birthday party prank or something. I think we all in our childhood were exposed to one of these things at one point. Imagine the global oceans filled with the stink of a stink bomb.
And
that's what
that killed a lot of things.
Yeah, there was this release of hydrogen sulfide, filled up the oceans. That killed a lot of the organisms. So part of what made it such a devastating extinction event was this global stink bomb. And that's not a good analogy with what's happening today. That was because of the deoxygenation of the oceans. And that had to do in part because of the massive die-off of forests from a continent, a very large continent called Pangaea, a huge continent that was very dry, and those forests were very tenuous. And when the warming happened, they died off. There was less carbon burial because of that, and that led to a drop in oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere, and we also saw that in the oceans. And so the point is there's some things that happened then that are analogous with today, but other things that aren't. And so it's not as bad as the Great Dying. Some of the factors that were involved there aren't implicated today. On the other hand, some of the factors are. It was the CO2 that caused the warming, and the warming had a huge impact, and certainly led to extinctions, and ocean acidification. All of that CO2 in the atmosphere meant the acidification of the oceans, and that's something that's happening today as well. So when we come away from it, it's sort of a mixed message. It's not as bad as the great dying, but certainly if we continue on the course that we're on, there are enough things that we do have in common with that event that we could create, another mass extinction if we continue what we're doing, if we continue to burn fossil fuels. That
would put humanity at risk? I mean, I view humans as the single most adaptable animal on planet. There's not an ecosystem on Earth where we don't show up. I have a hard time thinking that almost anything would kill off all humans. But if we're talking about a mass extinction, to what extent are we at risk?
Yeah, so not human extinction, probably not. There's another, interval in geological history. We sometimes talk about the PETM, which was maybe a better analogy for a hothouse planet that's literally too hot for large organisms like human beings, and that's probably out of reach. We're probably, it's hard to find enough carbon right now in fossil fuel reserves that would get the planet warm enough to yield something like the PETM. That having been said, you don't need literal human extinction to end civilization. Our civilization, that supports 8 billion plus people, carrying, a population that's much larger than the natural carrying capacity that this planet has to support human life. That infrastructure is dependent on the stability of our civilization. And if it collapses, then suddenly we can't support, we can't provide the food and the water and the space for 8 billion plus people. And so that's the real worry. It's not human extinction literally. It's the destabilization of human civilization. And that is a possibility if we continue on this course.
Totally get it. The book is Our Fragile Moment, How Lessons from Earth's Past Can Help Us Survive the Climate Crisis by Dr. Michael Mann. Dr. Mann, thanks so much for dropping by. It's always so nice to have you on our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Always a pleasure.
I also wanted to let you know, particularly those of you who have called into our program in the last 4 or 5 years, Sean, is how long Joyce worked with us. Joyce Nance, her last name is Nance. Joyce also, and I don't think I think I have mentioned it on the air a couple of times, Joyce is also an author. If you go over to Amazon and plug her name in, Joyce, Nance, you'll find several of her books over there. She writes thrillers, murder mysteries. But she was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic lung cancer that has already spread into her bones. When she quit her job here, we thought she just needed a chiropractor, and we learned several days later how bad this diagnosis was. And her family, her daughter, has put a GoFundMe page up to help her pay her bills. I made a donation last night. So the easy way to find it is just to go to GoFundMe.com, and there's a little search button up at the top, and click on that search button and type in Joyce Nance, Nance, and you'll get her GoFundMe page. I mean, it's terrible that we live in a country where people have to put up GoFundMe pages when they get sick, to pay all the bills and whatnot. And Joyce and her wife, Gail, are no doubt, having a really, really tough time now. She's started radiation and chemotherapy, and this is going to be tough. This is going to be a real battle for her. And the odds are stacked against her, and we all need to help however we can. So if you have any sort of particular affection for Joyce, Joyce Nance, Nance, over on GoFundMe, will get you there. And let's see if we can get those contributions up a little bit to help her out.